No, but before we're about to go live, so.
Oh yeah, no, YouTube takes the longest. Okay, great. All right, so we're live. It looks like we're live.
Cool. So we are live? Is that a yes?
Not yet, not on all
Not yet.
platforms yet. Just give me a second.
Okay, cool.
Mindy. Good girl. Good girl.
No problem. The internet's slow right now. Or the Matrix, I guess, since it's coming back.
And just Easton, one thing, Allie was just saying that the edit actually ran about 10 minutes for the conversation with Pearl. So it might be a little longer, but there's plenty of time for us to do a setup, I think.
Yeah, awesome. Welcome. I'm Easton Selby. I am Associate Dean in the Edwards College of Humanities and Fine Arts, and we are here for another live Edwards Live Cultural Arts at a Distance event. Today we have Dr. Dan Albergotti with us. He is a professor in the English department. He has an MA from Clemson, PhD from University of South Carolina, and an MFA from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. He is the author of 2 full-length collections of poems, including the titles Are the Boatloads and Millennial Teeth, which won the 2013 Crab Orchard Series in Poetry Open Competition. He is also the author of 2 poetry chapbooks with Unicorn Press. The first is The Use of the World, and the more recent Of Air and Earth. Even further, his credentials are that he's been awarded fellowships, including one from the South Carolina Arts Commission and from the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. His individual poems have been published in journals such as 32 Poems, the New Ohio Review, and the Virginia Quarterly Review. And his work has been reprinted in the New York Times Magazine and the Pushcart Prize. So Dan, thank you for being here today. This is a pretty interesting event for us because you're about a month ago, I believe, you reached out, or we saw online that one of your poems from, I don't remember how old the poem is, almost 20 years, I believe, In the Belly of the Whale, was actually animated by a woman named Pearl Taylor. And do you mind sort of telling us about, like, we actually arranged, and you had an interview over Zoom with Pearl Taylor,
Yes.
Who's based in Australia. And do you mind sort of telling us a little bit about the interview and setting it up? Because we're going to show about the 10-minute video for the public and then sort of talk about your work after that. So tell us about your interview with Pearl.
Sure. Thank you, Easton. The poem's Things to Do in the Belly of the Whale, I did write it in the spring of 2000, and it was published in a literary journal in 2001, and then it was included in The Boatloads, my first full-length collection. And so it's been around for a while. But with it's a poem about feeling stuck, as the title might suggest, feeling in stasis, trapped in a way. And during the quarantine, when everyone was social distancing and kind of feeling, enclosed in their own homes, the poem kind of started going viral a little bit online. And so it made its way out into the world. And Pearl Taylor, who is a paper artist in Australia, found it. And she decided to make a stop motion animation with her paper art for the poem. And she published it on YouTube, and I ran across it and couldn't believe it. I didn't know it was happening before it was out. So I was very moved by it. It's a beautiful piece of video art. And so I let some folks know about it, and you wonderful people in the Edwards College found a way, found her, made contact with Pearl Taylor, and set up a wonderful Zoom conversation that we had one evening. I was talking to someone on the other side of the world, and we talked for nearly 40 minutes. I think we both said we could have chatted for hours and hours, just two artists talking about ideas. And I think you've edited it down to about a 10-minute version for today that we're going to see. And then I'll read the poem for the first poem of my poetry reading section after we hear this conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan, for that setup. So anybody that's watching, we're about to show you a 10-minute segment of the Pearl Taylor interview with Dan Albergotti. And then at any point, if you guys have questions, please post questions to the chat function. We'll make sure that after Dan completes his readings and we talk about the interview, we'll make sure that all questions are asked and then answered, hopefully. So, all right, now for the video of Pearl Taylor and Dan Albergotti.
Hello, Pearl. How are you?
Hi, I'm really well, really well.
This is the first time that I've had a live conversation with someone kind of literally on the other side of the world. So this is a new experience for me. It's
myself also.
And the wonderful thing about it is that we kind of connected through a poem I wrote. I had no idea, I was alone writing these words 20 years ago now. And
wow.
That they could connect to someone, on the other side of the world, which I kind of take a lot of heart from that. It speaks a little bit to the universality, I guess, of the human spirit, that if we can tap into something via art, that we can reach someone on the other side of the world.
So I have all of the bits from the art piece that I then animated in 700 photographs.
Wow.
But I think that one of the reasons that it did speak to me, and as you spoke about all the different examples of people that found your poem, I fractured my spine I fractured the top of my skull in December. So my lockdown started early and I've actually, I'm only recently out of my neck brace. So I've had quite the journey starting my lockdown early. So I found that I had actually become accustomed to being in the belly of the whale myself. Everyone's going off to work. I'm at home, I'm painting, I'm making art, I'm keeping myself productive and distracted because I was quite bound to home. Then when the COVID lockdown started to happen, I felt that there was a lot of anxiety and distress in the world about what do we do while we're home. And I thought that your poem really had a real settling effect of like, we just need to wait. And I felt that because I'd already been in that belly, that I had that I could keep that quiet momentum in a way of helping people just breathe. We can just be here. And I just loved your listing of let's think about all the things we can do.
There's a moment in the poem, the speaker says, be grateful you're here where you can rest and wait. I think that a lot of people respond to that line. But the idea of being grateful in an unfortunate circumstance, can seem very strange. But in a lot of ways, desperate circumstances can open our eyes to things we're blind to all the time. It feels like,
Completely.
There's a little quote from the filmmaker David Lynch. He one time talked about how when he was at the very bottom of his career and was absolutely broke and desperate, felt like he had no hope. He said the world was so beautiful from down there because everything was up above him and everything was, and when we feel like we're in something of a hopeless situation, there's also, it seems like, an opportunity there to see all of the possibilities that might be there.
Completely.
Before, yeah.
Yes, and I think that was the experience of being in a neck brace and my fracture. It was a cycling accident, by the way. Yeah. But I definitely, there was this resting pause for me in my life, and that sense of in the words around that. Before that, I was treading water. You know, we were all treading water anyway. There was not this before, and yeah, before this sense of being in that belly. It's not like we were any more found or had any idea of what we were doing. We were just busier and more active and more anxious about what we were doing. Now we have to sit with all of that. And I found a complete sense of surrender and real beauty in that, because as you say, everything was above me and I literally, my neck was like this. So I could only look up. Yeah. So I think that speaks so much to that in that way as well.
But I'm always most moved by yours, and I think part of it is that there's that beautiful music, the beautiful piano, that and you engage with the words visually. You know, you read the poem with the eyes like you might encounter it in a book while hearing the score for it. And there's something just haunting about that, and it is the way it captures that sense of while you're receiving words, you're still in that realm of quiet. You know, I think your video quite captures it.
I think, yeah, thank you so much, Dan. I think that was really a lot of the feedback I got from it, from quite a lot of people, both on the YouTube and also kind of reaching out to me personally, were people that said, I could feel myself breathing. I was aware of myself in it, and I slowed down to the pace of it, which I think is so lovely, because we are so caught up in the world and we're so we are in control of the pace that we read at often. So it's like, oh, here's a poem, I'll skim read it, you know, and then I'll get on to the next thing. And I don't think I intentionally meant for it to actually, you know, I didn't have a huge amount of intentions at the start of it. I wanted to animate your poem. And I think that the pace that it came at was, well, I needed to make it slow enough to read. And that I really wanted to be an invitation into the pauses that I wanted to create. And I think it speaks to, it must be something I'm very, very interested in, because my final year, I studied at the College of Fine Arts in Sydney. And my final year, I took a video subject, and I really wasn't very interested in it at all. But my final piece was typing, and so screen filming, typing out the words to an Edna St. Vincent Millay poem, God's World, world, I cannot hold you close enough. And I just typed those words out at the pace that I thought people should read them. And then I projected that up onto an entire wall of leaves I had pinned up onto a gallery wall. So there must be something in me that wants to help people connect to the slowness of reading in a very visual, embodied way. It's good to know. Good to know about myself. Sometimes we don't realize these things until we're piecing them together in our own art practice.
Yeah, that the pauses that you have in the phrasing of the poem, you really were sensitive to some kind of internal, implicit, syntactical pauses that are there. They're not necessarily represented by the poem's line breaks. The poem does have line breaks. It's a long-lined poem, but some people, because it's so long-lined, have assumed it's a prose poem, and it's not. There are, you know, deliberate line breaks there, but a lot of enjambment. And a lot of times there's this implicit pause that when I would read it aloud, I would pause in the middle of a line, because I think syntactically it called for it in a way that, isn't cued by the typing. But you were catching on those phrases very much in the way you were delivering it in chunks,
Which is interesting because I actually, look, I'm over here in Melbourne. We hadn't met. I didn't ask permission to use your poem. I was doing this little church. Yeah, thank you. Doing this little church project. I put it up on YouTube specifically so I could share it with some people. I didn't, and so in a way, I actually felt that responsible for those words, and it wasn't a collaboration that you and I had gone, okay, so this is what we're going to do, this is what the poet wants out of it, this is what the paper artist, but there was just the sense of running around my house and scrambling up paper and breaking rulers, and just how to viscerally bring people into your words and taking poetic license with those pauses.
So Dan, that was I find that interview to be very powerful. I've seen excerpts from the extended edition, or at least I believe I have, because I know that this has been edited and culled down. So, what are your takeaways from this? Because it's interesting to bring up we're in an interesting time, interesting circumstances where, there's a lot of creative collaboration that's happening. And some of it, we don't know that it's actually happening. Like, you sort of found this, like it came across your desk. So like, what are some of your takeaways from this? Because I started taking tons of questions and writing questions down from this. So I've got a whole slew of things to ask. And I know that Allie's got stuff too. And then we'll get into readings too. So,
well, my first takeaway is just, on a personal level, I'm just profoundly gratified and flattered that my work, has touched other artists, that they want to respond in some way with it. I think that's the hope of any writer, any artist, is that someone will respond to it, in a generative way too, want to respond artistically to it. So, Pearl's video, like I said, you heard there in the edit, I said yours is my favorite, because of the fact that the words aren't spoken, but you encounter them visually. But that was taken out of the context of a discussion of other videos that I found around the same time. Pearl's is one of 4 videos that were made in the space of a couple of months from March to May, that none of whom were people I knew. They didn't know one another. And they were all of a sudden making video animations or films of this poem that I wrote 20 years ago. So, that's the crazy thing, is that the poem is not about COVID-19. The poem is, it's not about anything particularly, in a way. And I'm just happy that it speaks to people. I hope it taps into something of a universal emotion that can, hopefully make it do that. If it can do it over 20 years, my great hope is that it might do it over 200. That's the goal of any artist, is that sense of something of immortality, in that your work might survive you. I hope.
So it's interesting to me that 20 years later, your poem has been almost reimagined to a degree, because now that creative license has been adopted by several other people. And I know that you said that Pearl's is your favorite of the grouping that's reinterpreted this poem. But like, what's your take on it becoming almost this, the vernacular is now visual, right? It's not just like, it's the incorporation of the text with the animation.
Right.
Do you feel that now there's a different kind of, it takes on a different kind of existence, physically, metaphorically, whatever. Because, I remember I've read that poem, because that poem is hanging up in the hallway as a broadside, if I remember correctly, at the university. Mm-hmm. And I remember stopping and reading it, and then seeing it in a different context now, it's taken on, to me, it's taken on a new life. So what do you think about that?
This reminds me of the old debate of the early days of MTV, when artists, were concerned about these little movies made of their songs that make it impossible to hear the song out of the context of those images. Early 80s, I think there was a video made of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers song "You Got Lucky," and it's the band in a post-apocalyptic world discovering this remnants of human civilization, and on one of the screens that they find, they hit a button and it's the band playing the song live. But after seeing that video, I could never hear the song without those images. One thing about that, I guess that's one of the reasons that I really, really appreciate Pearl's interpretation, because it does interpret it with images, but there's a purity in how you encounter the words of the poem, in a way, because it's silent, that it doesn't overlay too much on what's there on the poem already. And while I'm here, let me just, as a side note, say to say hers is my favorite is not taking away anything from those others. That those other three were just amazing in their own way too, and I'm very flattered by those. One, by the way, folks, is from a sock puppet reciting my poem, so make sure you go check that one out.
So I like your reference to the early days of MTV. I would also add, everybody, Professor Albergotti has an impeccable taste in music. Just side note to that. So,
over my left shoulder there.
Yeah. So all right. So if you want to, would you like to? You're going to do a reading.
Yes.
Of the poem. So we can segue into that if you would like, and then move on to other things.
Yeah, I think I'm going to read about 20 minutes. So I'm going to start with that poem, if that's good. That's going to read poems from across several books and more recent poem, and then maybe take questions after the reading. So
that sounds perfect.
Great. Thank you. So because I know many people will have read this poem before and maybe encountered the whole thing, but since you only get snippets of the actual text there in Pearl's video, I am going to start my reading with the reading of that poem. But before I do, I just want to take a moment to thank Pearl Taylor publicly here for animating the poem, and to thank Allie Crandall, Abby Sink, and Easton Selby for all you've done to make these Edwards Live events happen, and for inviting me to participate. So this is Things to Do in the Belly of the Whale. Measure the walls, count the ribs, notch the long days. Look up for blue sky through the spout. Make small fires with the broken hulls of fishing boats. Practice smoke signals. Call old friends and listen for echoes of distant voices. Organize your calendar. Dream of the beach. Look each way for the dim glow of light. Work on your reports. Review each of your life's 10 million choices. Endure moments of self-loathing. Find the evidence of those before you. Destroy it. Try to be very quiet and listen for the sound of gears and moving water. Listen for the sound of your heart. Be thankful that you are here, swallowed with all hope, where you can rest and wait. Be nostalgic. Think of all the things you did and could have done. Remember treading water in the center of the still night sea, your toes pointing again and again down into the black depths. And speaking of being very quiet, I'm going to pause for a moment here to tell you I'm at my home, of course, and my two dear dogs are in the room here with me. They were not happy with trying to be put into their own room there to be alone. So I have Mindy at my feet, and Freddie's over here in a bed over my right shoulder, and everything's going to be fine. Maybe you might hear her snore a little bit, as long as the UPS man doesn't ring the doorbell, in which case you might get a dose of chaos. So just a little bit of warning. So I'm going to move to a couple of poems from my second full-length book, Millennial Teeth, now. And this poem I want to read, and I want to read it because of the moment we're in. What I hope is as transformative as it feels right now. Of course, we've been disappointed many times before, but a moment of some maybe more than usually honest reckoning with our nation's very troubled past with slavery, segregation, persistent racism, systemic racism. I wrote this poem after my friend Natasha Trethewey once asked a simple question: why don't you write about it? She was talking about writing about the issue of race in the South, which she did naturally, having grown up in Mississippi and Atlanta and experiencing a biracial existence as a woman whose father was white and whose mother was Black. And that was a very challenging question. I wrote this poem partially in response to that challenge, because silence is, as we know, not harmless. And this poem is about harmful silence. At the end of the poem, the speaker appreciates a moment of peace and silence, but I hope that you will hear it as an anti-silence poem. I'll just give you one more bit of pretext or preface to the poem, just to say that it does arise out of a real incident. My father, I was at home at my parents' house as an adult in, I think, 2002 or so. And it was Christmas time. It was Christmas Eve, as a matter of fact. And one of the national news stories was the birth of some septuplets, 7 children, to an immigrant couple who were Black. And that was a news story there. On this Christmas Eve, my mother and sister were attending a candlelight service at the church, and my father and I were home alone. And the plan was that I would go pick up pizza from, I think Papa John's it was, and have it ready for my sister and mother when they returned. So my father and I were sitting in our living room and watching the television, watching the news. And the news report went to this story, and the detail that the news anchor gave was that the weakest of the children of those septuplets, that condition had improved. They had worried that child would not survive, and now it looked like the child would have an excellent chance to survive. So that's just to give you preface. That's what we saw on the screen. Holy Night. My father said he wished the child were dead. He didn't say it in so many words, but he said it. And it was Christmas Eve. I breathed in silent tension next to him. The news anchor said that of the 7 born to a Black couple 3 nights before, the weakest child had gathered strength and would, the doctor said, most likely now survive. I'm sorry to hear that, my father hissed. That's just what this country needs, 7 more. Of course he used the word. You know he did. The television screen blurred to pastels. I sat in silence next to him, the man whose blood was my blood, whose eyes looked like mine, and tried to breathe the thick air between us. He was my father. This was Christmas Eve. Lord of this other world, what will you make of this? And reader, what will you accept? That I stood up without a word and left the house, got into my car, and then drove to the pizza place, as he expected me to, picked up our order and drove back to that goddamned house to join my mother and sister who'd been singing Christmas hymns by candlelight at the evening service while my father wished death upon a child? Will you accept that I wept on that drive, listening to Radiohead's The Tourist, wishing I could stop the world spinning cold, drive off its surface and take to the sky, break its gravitational hold, sever myself from it forever then and there? Reader, I hear your silence now. Hear it like I heard silence that night in the space between my father's words and the night sky. I could see through my windshield. One bright star, impossibly distant, already dead, pulsing its pure light through millennia of utter void to meet my aching eyes. Maybe it's better that you have no words, that I have no answer. Maybe better to just recall the peace of that short drive, its brief respite where music and silence were one blessing, and the dark night holy. Inside. In the lake, the cottonmouth. In the sea, the shark. In the soil, the growing seed. In the tree, the lark. In the dark, the insect's call. In the light, the trust. In the child, the weight of years. In the steel, the rust. In the dust, the memory. In the air, your soul. In my head, the unsaid words. In the diamond, coal. In the hole, your polished box. In the earth, the quake. In my blood, your vessel ran. In these lines, its wake. Speaking of already dead stars, we're approaching July 4th, and so I wanted to read this very short poem from the chapbook of Air and Earth. I wrote this poem after learning from Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds on their album Push the Sky Away that Arcturus, a red giant star that's in our relative neighborhood of the galaxy, light from that star takes 37 years to reach Earth. And I learned that not long, I don't know, it might have been the year 2013, maybe the year 2012. And then, so I thought about those 37 years and I started doing a little math. And I realized that the upcoming July 4th, 2013, light would be striking the sky from that star. We'd see the light from that star in our night sky on the that left Arcturus while we were celebrating the bicentennial of the United States on July 4th, 1976. So I started thinking about that a little bit and wrote this very short little poem. So it's got a little head note. The head note reads, light traveling at 186,000 miles per second from Arcturus, a red giant in our relative neighborhood of the Milky Way, takes approximately 37 years to appear in Earth's night sky. And the title of the poem is July 4th, 2013. This beam of light that pricks the sky tonight left Arcturus in 1976, when we were all about ourselves, our pride reflected in new quarters and fireworks. The space was empty between here and there, when we watched actors march with fife and drum and laughed about their antique clothes and hair, astounded by how far we thought we'd come. I ask a lot how far we've come lately. This is another poem from that chapbook of Air and Earth. It's a strange little sonnet. It is titled To Sleep, and it takes that kind of sonnet tradition of a title being to something to heart. And of course, there's a fairly famous John Keats sonnet called To Sleep. But I mean the title actually as an infinitive verb. I think Keats might have as well, by the way. So as opposed to being addressed to the abstraction or the idea of sleep, the poem is the verb to sleep. And it's a sonnet, but it's a sonnet that's rhyme scheme is palindromic, I guess. It goes from A to G and then G in reverse back to A. So you'll hear a little couplet in the middle, but all the rhymes are mapped out that way. So, to sleep. They die so many times before our eyes, the footage rolling in a loop for hours, run down or choked or shot or cast in flames. They disappear as pixels dissipate into the memory's short-term holding zone, a wasteland filled with everything we hold dear. Like oceans where trash and bodies are dumped, or gold-gilt back alleys where love is trumped, the place we store cries we don't want to hear, where we see no sin in being alone. In sleep, though, the faces regenerate and white noise coheres into whispered names. We know it then, that all their deaths are ours. We die so many times before we rise. I'm going to read 3 more poems. These have not been collected yet anywhere. They've been published in literary journals, but they've not been in a book or chapbook yet. And the first of these was published in 32 Poems magazine. Shout out to 32 Poems. The editor of that terrific journal, George David Clark, thank you for publishing this poem. This poem came also from learning a little scientific fact. I learned that the vole, the small little field mouse, the vole is one of the most apparently empathetic animals that researchers have studied. That I don't know how they study this, but apparently if one vole in a group is physically injured in some way, the others will rush to it and touch it and seem to be comforting it, and that researchers detect the level of I guess anxiety reflected in hormones, I suppose, or adrenaline or whatnot, that the level in the other voles of this excitement and danger and feeling wounded, I guess, is nearly equal to the vole that's actually physically injured. So I don't know that has anything to do with this poem. The vole only makes it through here as a metaphor. But I've loved the vole ever since learning that. So anyway, the poem is titled The Elect. Like the vole, I have wandered afield under the greater sky, not knowing 9/10 of my brethren are already gone. I have found another of my kind and joined her walk toward the sun in its setting. I have entered the earth. I have nosed the root that feeds the vine. I have seen the remains of others, stopping and walking on. One morning I woke and the other did not. I have felt the warmth that dries the dew. I have been happy. Above me, I have seen a wheeling halo of birds. Next poem appeared in the New Ohio Review. Thank you to the editors of that journal as well, David Wanzik, the chief editor. It's another short poem. That last poem was 12 lines, so is this one. And my father appeared in an earlier poem. My father also appears in this poem. I was essentially estranged from him and much of my family for the last probably 2 years of his life. And this is about the last time I saw him alive, which, as you imagine, might be very emotionally complicated. It's called Final Visitation. After talking with him for 30 minutes, as he lay cocooned in a thin wool blanket, I told my father I had to head back to Conway. He turned his ashen head a bit and said, "Conway, that's where my son lives." I met my sister's eyes before fixing his in mine to say, "Father, I am your son." His eyes widened in that way that makes us say, "You look like you've seen a ghost," or as if he'd found himself the quarry of a hunt. I touched his hand before I left to show him I was real. I think I could have walked through walls to get to my car. So grateful was I to be that ghost. And this final poem of the reading portion is the most recent published poem I've had. Appears in the most recent issue of the online journal Thrush Poetry Journal, which I encourage you to Google and search for. It's a really terrific online literary journal that appears 6 times a year. Thank you to editor Helen Vittoria for publishing this poem. And if any of my students are watching, I'll say in advance that this is a poem that breaks at least 3 cardinal rules that I emphasize that you should follow. So do as I say, not as I do, and just remember that every good rule is made to be broken. So this poem is titled Summary Report. We fell from the fall. We slid down that slide. We crouched at the call. We hid our young hide. We woke in a yoke. We pushed at their pace. We jumped at their joke. We reckoned the race. We battered the brother. We anchored the art. We anchored the ark. We othered each other. We darkened the dark. We pilfered our power. We laid a writ law. We tumbled a tower. We jagged with a jaw. We coded all colors. We feathered all faiths. We denoted dollars. We wrangled with wraiths. We dirtied the dust. We smothered with smoke. We readied the rust. We spiked as we spoke. We drew up the deeds. We set all the snares. We negated needs. We canceled all cares. We clicked every clock. We scratched every screen. We wrecked every rock. We gulped gasoline. We fired up the forest. We reddened the rain. We pitched out the poorest. We ditched the storm drain. We withered the whale. We lathered the lake. We shattered the shale. We quickened the quake. We eyed every iris. We dragged on the drugs. We veiled the last virus. We bedded with bugs. We cornered in caves. We laughed at the last. We wave from the waves. We passed in your past. Thank you. Those are the poems I have for you today.
Those are absolutely beautiful, Dan.
Thank you.
So before we get into the real questions, what were the 3 cardinal rules that were broken?
One, I always tell my students that enjambment is such an essential thing to master and to use in your poetry, to, not have the line and the sentence be the same thing in a poem, right? That makes things terribly boring, right? That making the line and the sentence work in some sort of tension with one another by wrapping the line around the end, the sentence around the end of the line, and having it move over into the next line is very important for the potential tension and harmony you can create with words and the form of the poem. And that's a poem of I think 24 stanzas, 48 lines, and every single line is a sentence. And of course, I always talk about the importance of creating variation of sentence length and sentence syntax to create, to avoid a sense of boring repetition, to create a sense of dynamics. And every one of those lines, which is a sentence, uses exactly the same syntactical structure with the same first person plural pronoun, and gosh, what's the final thing? It's got 48 lines. And I always say, be very careful about when you got a narration going in a poem or something, that you don't violate verb tense consistency. And the penultimate line in my poem, all those things are in past tense, but the 47th line is in present tense. Right? So I break verb tense consistency, but for a very important reason, right? Because we wave from the waves. I want this to be, kind of the generation that passed and ruined everything, waving with this summary report we've left for the generation of humans, living in caves, waiting for the nuclear winter to end so they can crawl back out, I guess, or something. I do see it as kind of an apocalyptic poem. So that while the poem documented all the terrible ways we failed from the beginning, as, with the people we leave to the next generations, this is that voice saying, here we are, sending you this message, waving to you from the waves of, I guess, sea rise and ecological catastrophe. So anyway, that's my too long answer to your question about rules.
So Dan, I've got to say, man, you may or may not have broken me with poems, and I sympathize with several of those poems, but it's what you've reminded me is how and why I fell in love with poetry. As I remember even pre-high school, like studying poetry into college, falling in love with poetry again, and then leaving poetry and for other things, and then coming back around. And it's interesting. In the last, I think, year, I've been to 2 poetry readings, both of which literally broke me. I teared up at a friend of mine, worked with a poet on a collaborative project, photography and poetry together, and looking at how the images relate to the work. And I'm like in tears at this lecture. And then, hearing your poetry, how personal they are and how willing you are to share them with us in this capacity. I think you broke me.
Sorry.
And I appreciate that, because it's, it's like the work is powerful, and it's amazing to me how poetry, which is such it's a time limited thing. It's like you said, there's so many lines, so many letters, so many words, and I mean, its existence has the power to change things and change people. And I feel like your work sort of takes that on, and even your selection of poems today. I'm curious about how you selected these poems. Like there is obvious intent there, and I'm curious about how you narrowed that scope. Like, were these your favorite, or did you find them the most relevant? Like, can you sort of speak to that?
I do. Let me just say too, before I answer that particular question, the idea of breaking someone in a good way. I think good art does that, you know, in terms of not breaking us apart, but cracking us open like an egg almost, you know, because we build up the mundanity of daily existence and our distractions, everything tends to create a kind of hard exterior shell. And I think art can very productively help us shed some of that shell and break us open to be more vulnerable, you know, and to understand what's at stake. Jack Gilbert says that poetry is one of the very few ways we have of making, this is how he puts it, what's important visible. I always love that. And yes, in choosing poems for any reading, I always do think about how those poems will resonate in the current moment. But you know, I obviously two of the poems, well, many of the poems, I'm very much thinking about our moment of crisis and self-evaluation in America, not just Holy Night, but, you know, July 4th, 2013, and To Sleep Too, which is a poem, of course, that also makes oblique references to, you know, horrific scenes of violence that the media shows us, often directed towards people of color. You know, how we become numb to it, you know, and the media gives it to us for a little while, and we're all in danger of being saturated by something else in this distraction, you know, filled culture, and it being gone, you know, and how difficult it is to keep one's focus, I guess. So I was thinking about those poems for this particular moment. Of course, summary report, you know, that line near the end, we veiled the last virus. That was kind of an apocalyptic line. That poem was written. It wasn't meant to be a COVID-19 poem, but that line, I was already working on the poem, and that line did come about sometime in February, where it looked like things were getting out of hand globally, you know, with this. And that felt like a apocalyptic kind of thing there too. So reading that poem today is meaningful as well.
Yeah, and I think that somebody in Renee Soto in the comments has mentioned just the sheer scale. So she commented from the whale to the vole, and so as I'm dealing with a mole infestation in my yard right now, we've been talking about a lot of this, but I'm really interested in your thoughts in terms of that scale, how we talk about being inside something to walking through walls, like this sense of scale within the poems that you selected.
Thank you. And hi, Renee. I love you. Renee is a former classmate of mine in the UNCG MFA program. And I haven't seen her in years. So thank you for tuning in. And I'm on Zoom here, and I'm looking at group chat with the Zoom people. So I'm not seeing what questions are coming through in Facebook Live, just so you know. But I before I answer Renee's question, I noticed that what you put in the question there, Allie, when you gave the previous question, you said it was from George David Clark. So that's the editor of 32 Poems. So hi, David. Thanks you for you don't have to apologize, Allie. That's great. So anyway, thank you all for tuning in. And Renee, thanks for that question. I think that one of the beautiful things about poetry is its scale is always immense even when it's tiny. You know, you read an 8-line poem from Emily Dickinson. You know, Emily Dickinson said that the definition of poetry for her is when she feels as if the top of her head had been taken off. You know, she said that's how I identify poetry. If that's how I feel after I've experienced it, as if the top of my head had been physically taken off. that even in 8 little lines of iambic tetrameter, trimeter, ballad stanza, she can make the world feel like it shifted, like something monumental happened. So scale, the idea of something small being grand, is always, I think, in poetry. But I think the poet is often, how to put it, drawn to the grand and the minuscule in equal proportion, right? You want to think in immensity, everything. But the poet's also the person that sees the vole, in some grass by a building while a parade is going by, right? And everyone's watching the parade, and the poet's over there looking at the small little animal living its small life, which in the vole's perspective is grandiosity. So I'm fascinated with very small things, and I'm very fascinated with large things, as you can tell. I mean, I think it's amazing that that light, the fastest thing we know of in the universe, 186,000 miles per second, takes 37 years to get to us from a star that's in the scale of the universe, like right next door. I mean, that's amazing. That's the immensity of that. In another life, I must have studied astronomy because I'm fascinated with it. In this life, I could never cut the math.
So Dan, I will say that it's been really interesting throughout this process today, this last hour, to really, hear from you, like where your inspiration comes from. Because it's always interesting within the creative process, like how you sort of like latch on to small things. And then if we're talking about scale, like you take something as small as the vole and then make it into something as powerful as a poem. But I will say we're running short on time. We're almost at the hour.
Okay.
So do you want to tell us first, I want to say thank you for doing this. This has been inspiring to me. It's been wonderful to hear you. I've never been to one of your readings, but now I want to go buy all of your books if I can find them. So, but do you want to tell us where you're going to be for the next 6 months? Like here pretty soon?
Yeah, this is something I've known about for 3 years, and thanks for asking. I have no problem sharing it here. I haven't found a right time to make a public announcement for it on Facebook. It always seems like the least important news in our world at the moment. But nearly 3 years ago, I learned that I've been awarded a fellowship at the Amy Clampett House in Massachusetts, and that they schedule these very far out, as you know, and mine was scheduled quite far out. So I have the fall residency there. So the Amy Clampett House in Lenox, Massachusetts is operated by the Berkshire Taconic Trust. And it's named for the wonderful American poet Amy Clampett, who bought this house with money that she won from a MacArthur Genius Grant. And then not too many years after she did that, she unfortunately died of cancer, and her husband bequeathed the home to this trust to provide fellowships, long-term fellowships for poets to go and write in solitude for either 6-month or full-year residencies. So I was very fortunate to be awarded one of those residencies, and I will be leaving in early July, and we'll be up there until late December, hopefully writing good poems, and hopefully they'll be good, and missing my wife and my dogs here. But they do allow me to come home for occasional week-long visits, so I won't be completely away from them all that time. So, but yeah, thanks for asking.
Yeah. Well, one last thing. Would you mind reminding the audience that if they would like to take some of your classes, what you teach? Obviously, it's not going to be this fall.
It's not going to be this fall. I'm off the schedule for the fall, but in the spring I will be. I don't know what the exact schedule is, but I believe I will be teaching the graduate class in the forms of poetry and the undergrad class in Poetry 1. And there may be another writing class there in the spring. I think there definitely will be another class. I'm just not exactly sure what it will be. So check the schedule there. I teach mostly writing classes, poetry writing classes at the undergraduate and the graduate level. So I hope some folks will be interested in sign up. And I hope some of my students might have shown up to see me violate those rules. And I wish them all the best. And here, one final thing in case. This is very rude, but here's Freddie, who I often talk to my students and my friends about. I just woke him up from his little nap, but I just wanted to give him some screen time. Mindy's a little too large to pick up, but she's right here at my feet. Thanks.
Well, Dan, thanks for doing this again.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll get to do this again after in the next 6 months, like maybe January, we can come back. And if you want to recite or read any more poems, we can do this. We can have round 2.